kind of what it was meant to be and stuff like that. We'll also go through and be offering questions whenever. So can you guys see my presentation right now? Is it visible?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, we'll just get started then. So the first thing to talk about is what Outreachy actually is. And yeah, I'll skip that. Yep, so well, Outreachy is an outreach program. It's a 13-week internship that is either across June or August, and November and January, and it's focused on providing underrepresented communities in the computer science fields, technology fields in general, the opportunity to contribute to an open source project. So specifically Wikimedia for me, but there's a large swath of different open source projects. It's open to anybody regardless of any kind of specific, ethnicity, gender, age, student status, basically anything you can think of is open to absolutely anybody. The main focus is just somebody who has been in some way underrepresented in the technology fields, which can mean, huge types of things. That can mean somebody who has suffered through poverty. That can mean somebody who, just lives in a country where there's very little technology. Whatever that means for each individual is something that is taken very seriously by the organizers. And then through going through an application where you perform and do open source tasks that are related to the given task at hand, you, as you apply, you come to learn more about open source principles, come to learn more about programming in general, and then if selected, you get to work with one or two mentors, occasionally another intern, but typically one or two mentors to undergo a specific project. So I was very lucky and very grateful to have been selected to work as an Outreachy intern for the Wikimedia Foundation, and specifically working on the project What's in a Name, which is focused on automatically adding first and last author names to Wikidata items. Yeah, so I am going to leave questions towards the end, so I'm going to talk about the presentation, but if you have any questions about Outreachy, who can apply, what it means to mentor, because I recommend for anybody here who is more involved in Wikimedia to really consider mentoring as well. Just anything that you have contributed yourself on Wikidata that you think can have more work done, or Wikimedia in general that you think people could benefit by contributing from, is something that can be done. Yeah, and you get tangible results, tangible projects. I've managed to get a bot request approved. I've managed to add a lot of other information on Wikidata. And yeah, so let's talk about my own project and what I did as an Outreachy intern. So basically, the big problem here is that lots of Wikidata scientific articles, so that means academic articles with a specific P31 property, so an instance of property equating to scholarly article or scientific article, have missing or incomplete author information. What does this mean? So if you look at the image here, you can see that we have the authors. So we have, John Wang, Shishu Chang, Samuel K. Hung, but we only have their series ordinal, which means the order they were referenced in their citations. What we don't have is their first name, their last name, and we also, the reference here, we don't know how dated it is, how accurate it is, but we don't have sufficient information that allows for us to kind of expand the scope of what author information can actually look like. So when what you actually want to have in any kind of author page like this is you want to have a series ordinal, and then you also want to have an author given name and an author last name. And these are both relatively new properties. They were added, I think, kind of a year ago or a bit less. So many articles on Wikidata don't have these, but there are also, many articles on Wikidata that don't have any authors, period, that you can obtain. So in general, it's just what happens when you have a kind of data repository that is kind of organized and developed by volunteers, is that you are naturally going to end up having some incomplete data. But that is something that we can help do. We can help add author information here. So that would mean either adding entire author references. That would mean something where a property with either author or author name string, depending on what you're dealing with. But I'll talk a bit more about that when talking about the actual project. As well as adding a series ordinal if it doesn't exist, adding a citation if it doesn't exist, and adding more author information. And that's useful because it allows eventually for stuff like WikiCite to integrate author information into citations that are used across Wikipedia and other Wikimedia projects, which then leads to easier searching for users and for scholars and anybody using Wikimedia as a database source. They're allowed to more easily find author information, and by giving more name information, that's able to be more accurate. So you might think this is really easy, you might just be able to kind of extract the author names and put them down, but this ends up being much trickier than one would expect. So why is it tricky? This is because names are more complicated than one might initially expect. When you ask the question what a given name is or what a family name is, it might initially seem very simple. It might be like, oh, well, first name's obviously your first name, last name's obviously the thing that comes after that. But that simplifies things way too much and fails to consider many, many authors. And when you look at the academic sphere, I think it's just been announced that China has surpassed the USA in terms of overall research output. So you have names that might not conform to what we kind of typically think of as English speakers, as kind of conventional Western names with one given name and one last name. So we have to be able to deal with those accurately because that is a substantial amount of research. And also, even if it wasn't, right, we just want to be accurate and comprehensive when it comes to other names, cultural differences. And yes, so here are some examples of the different problems that arise across cultures. So one is people who are Tamil, who might only have a given name and have no family name, or it might be the same thing. You have to parse that. Latin American names, and then some Spanish speaking things as well, where you have at least two surnames, but some people who are not American may expand that even further and have lots and lots and lots of last names. Same thing as we talked about with Chinese, Japanese, Korean names, where the given name is typically followed by the family name, and they're usually two symbols that have no space between them, so the way you have to parse them has to be different, as well as even with Western names, right? You might have somebody who has two middle names or has kind of a compounded last name, or somebody who usually uses an initial, but then a citation, you don't see the initial. So just lots of different problems that can arise when you're dealing with name parsing. So if you want to program that and actually want to have that be implemented when adding author information, you have to keep all of that in mind. Another problem is that there are many previous human and bot errors on Wikidata articles. So to talk a bit more about that, this, across my internship, ended up being a much bigger problem than I initially anticipated. The biggest one, and one that I've recently kind of managed to start fixing, was that lots of previous bots added authors and author names things property. So for people that don't know, an author property is a property that links to a Wikidata item that corresponds to a researcher, whereas an author name string is just a string because there is no Wikidata item page for that author. So you typically only want one of these, especially because we now have qualifier properties that allow for you to put the string for a given author. I have a theory that this might have been added before this was the case of people just kind of thought, oh, we should have both. There are also lots of other types of kind of basic human error. Some are just misspellings or name being out of order. Sometimes you have the duplicate same author. Sometimes people inserting unknown values instead of authors because their bot wasn't able to parse the authors. Sometimes you have no citations or inaccurate citations, and those have to be fixed because you obviously, if you're adding names to a scientific article to eventually be used and cited in other Wikimedia areas, you want your own thing to be cited, right? So you want that to work accurately. So you have to also deal with this when you want to automatically add author names. So the first thing I had to do when kind of figuring out what I wanted to do and how I wanted my program to work was, okay, so I know I want to automatically get citations from a given article and extract those, but how should I get these citations, right? And I very quickly realized where, let's just go to a kind of sample scholarly article. Should be fairly easy, it'll just take a second, and you guys can all see that, right? Yeah, let's just go to one. Let's see. Yeah, perfect. Okay, so here you can see a bit more detail as well. Here's an example of an author name string. This one actually isn't complete, so I'm sure my bot will eventually deal with this. It's missing the author given name property and the author last name property, and it's also not referenced, and you want them to be referenced. And yeah, so I realized here that something that all scholarly articles have, or at least all the ones I'm dealing with, are identifiers, which link to academic databases that, if you look at them, have, let me find that quickly, just make sure I have that, show menu, have the ability to export citations in a given way. And in those export citations, you have author names that you can eventually parse and use. So I was thinking, if I'm able to use a given identifier to get author names, I can get all author name information and put that in a Wikidata article. But what I had to think of is which databases do I want to deal with. So I did some data analysis to see what the most common database was on Wikidata, and by far it's P698, which for people that don't know is PubMed. So that is medical articles. And I talked about this with my mentors, and that ended up being because of medical community efforts and scientific efforts to kind of upload the articles to Wikidata and have those be cited. In general, if you look at these are all highly scientific databases. There's not a lot of like humanities archives, which I think would be an interesting project later on would be to upload more articles that correspond to specific arts archives. Yeah, here's another one that's interesting. These are specifically Chinese academic articles. So the way I searched for this was doing a query, which specifically looked at the property of language of work being Chinese. And then again, almost all of them are PubMed articles, but there's one here which appeared for no other language, which was CJFD, which is a Chinese journal federal database, which if you looked at this one, the citations in it were in Chinese characters. So that could be a way to potentially deal with Chinese names that I started considering, but eventually had to drop the complications, but I might go back to it. I'll talk a bit more about that later on. So essentially what I did when choosing what databases to get from here on the identifiers to eventually extract citation was looking at this data and seeing, okay, these are the most common databases on Wikidata. I can get the most articles if I'm able to get these. So what did I end up doing from there? So there was basically a process to what I had to do, right? So I had to get articles that I knew were missing author information. So an article like this, which doesn't have all the things I wanted to have, which is a series ordinal, an author given name, an author last name, a reference, and if it's an author, not an author name string, you also want the object stated as property, which gives you the string. So I had to get that. And the way I did that was by creating a Sparkle query. If people aren't familiar with Sparkle, they can ask a bit more about that during the Q&A, but essentially it's just kind of similar to SQL query where you look through the Wikidata database, you filter out specific things. So I was filtering out any articles that had the author information I needed, basically, to get specifically the ones I needed. And then obviously I then use PyWikibot, which is a very powerful tool to traverse through Wikidata, to add statements, to delete statements, to go through them to make sure that stuff are missing. And to actually get the citations, I had two options. I could parse it by just literally going like, oh yeah, let's inspect this, look at the HTML, or I could end up using academic APIs, which I ended up doing because it's kind of more ethical, more standardized, as well as leads to you being able to do faster queries every day. So here's basically what I was talking about. So you get the citations through extracting them, you parse those by doing string parsing through regex, and you add them by finding matches. So you find a match in all these different ways. So first I check for exact matches, which means that an exact match, for instance, would be here if I see list in JJ, and that is exactly the same as this because I would always switch the stuff to be first name, last name. That would be an exact match, and their information would be added. But I also allowed for more lenient matches, checking for initials, checking for other things, because there were lots and lots of different types of names to look for. Would you consider using Zotero translators to access? Okay, I'll look at that question in a second once I finish the structure, because I did consider using Zotero, and I think my co-intern also thought about it. But it was something that, because it led to us leading to articles that potentially were not on Wikidata, we thought would be inefficient, essentially, because my project was very focused on dealing with articles that already existed in Wikidata because so many of them have missing information. And I kind of started to believe the philosophy that it's better to improve on the articles that Wikidata already has rather than to add new ones. My other intern worked much more on adding articles. So because of that, I wanted to focus specifically on identifiers that you could find on each article. Yeah, I hope that makes sense. And then multiple matches basically means what I was talking about before, where sometimes you'll have multiple hits, right? Like that would be something like here, having multiple JJ listings, and then what are you going to do, right? Because the series ordinal is going to be different, which might lead to problems because, you know, one JJ listing might go to one university, other one might go to another university. You need that to be accurate to be able to provide accurate author information later on other Wikimedia sections. So when we do a test run of the program, I'll do a quick one of the very short batches. You'll be able to see that more clearly. But yeah, basically, if there are multiple matches, you want to skip that for sure. So currently, the biggest hurdle were those multiple matches, because if you have multiple exact matches, there really is no way for the robot to identify which one belongs to what author. So what I am currently working on for doing that is a Wikidata game. And for people that don't know what that is, I'll show you guys quickly. So those are basically, let's see if this one works. With Wikidata games, sometimes they don't work too well. Yeah, I'll take a look at when I know it works. Let's see, I think, yeah, this one works. Yeah, so you would look at, for example, it gives you two different wiki data items and you have to identify they're the same ones. These fairly clearly different, so I'll mark that as different actually. And yeah, it's just so I'm doing this for names. So within the same Wikidata article, I'm seeing if two author items in the article are the same or different, and then if they are the same, adding the author information as needed. So yes, so that's what I'm working on, as well as I want to eventually implement the Chinese Journal of Federal Databases, because that would allow for more precise implementation of Chinese characters, making sure they're always translated correctly. But this is very, very difficult because this specific academic database, it's not like ADS, for example, or PubMed, which provides very easy API access and very easy even parsing access. SageAFD has very kind of discrete APIs that are very difficult. So yeah, before I finish that off and move on to the Q&A, I'd like to do a quick demonstration of this. And this ended up being a bot, just by the way. So Wikidata bot, I'll change my screen to be that so you guys can see. Is that it? Yes. Okay, so that's my terminal, so you guys can see. And I'll show you guys the bot running. This will just be for 25 articles. So what this is doing is it's calling on a database where I'm adding on multiple matches, but we'll see that happen in a second. Okay, and there's an example of multiple matches, so I'll talk that through with you guys in a second. There's a lot of things happening here because there are a bunch of checks added, and I'll explain that to you guys. Okay. And there's one problem here that I'll talk about that needs to be addressed and improve it in the future. But here you can see stuff being added, and we'll go through this one quickly just so you can see the change of the article from before and after. So let me just make this a bit bigger. Oh, well, let's see that afterwards. So now it's running. Essentially, it's adding all author name information. I'll talk through some of the other ones that are happening here. So here, for instance, it detected 2 matches. And these are heuristic because they're not exactly the same as RB Russell, but my program is able to detect things like initials. It's able to detect, kind of different things happening, and both of these were matches. But because they were multiple matches, it skipped it. And then if you're seeing here, if it's saying already checked, I know what this means because they're in the database for multiple matches. They've already been checked as having multiple matches, and therefore need to be finished off by being completed in the game. This is currently being worked on. And there you go. So these were already checked. Unfortunately, not too many were checked on this one, just because sometimes with Sparkle, because the way it gets articles isn't always completely random, you might get similar items being found. And that's it. But for instance, let's go to this article, which all information was obtained. And I'll show you guys that. Okay, so if you look at this one, so right now these things were all missing information. They weren't complete. If we refresh this now, you'll see they have complete information. So they all have the series ordinal, the object stated as for authors, the author given and last name for both, and the reference obtained from PubMed, the PubMed ID, and the date it was retrieved. So yeah, that's it. And you can see the edits as well on the edit page. Another thing I want to do is kind of compress the edits because right now there are a lot of them, but that requires kind of making a copy of the article, which might have some problems when potentially getting rid of some problems and some duplicates. And yeah, so there's quite a lot of things implemented here. There's one other thing. I've added an automatic check for duplicates of authors and author name strings, which I've kind of come to detect as maybe being added before the object stated as property was added, and getting rid of the author name string. So you can only keep the author if you're able to very confidently prove that these are the exact same thing. And that was a big thing of this project, was confidence in exactness, or confidence in matching. You have to be very careful because you don't want to pollute Wikidata by kind of maybe having something that's imperfect and just changing it to be perfect in a different way. It just makes the history of that item so much more complex and makes it kind of quite difficult to work with. So you had to be very confident. And yeah, so that's been my Outreachy project. I've had a really good time doing it. I think I've learned so much about Wikidata. I'm definitely going to keep working on Wikidata as kind of a volunteer, or if any option comes up, that may be cool as well. But definitely even as a volunteer, I just come to really like it. It's some organization that really fits my way of thinking. I quite like kind of organizing things into categories and thinking about how those categories are objective and subjective and what's involved in those categories. So that is stuff that really impacts me. So I find it really appeals to me. And for anybody who's interested in either open source software, either as working as a contributor to it or kind of mentoring in it, I think Outreachy is a great option because there's so many kind of things you can find. You can find companies that really appeal to you, and I think Wikimedia is a great one. Maybe here it obviously appears to you some way. It allows you to kind of really understand the inside out of how Outreachy works. So yeah, that's it. Yep, I'll happily put those links in the chat for you. So this is my Outreachy blog. This is my bot request that was eventually approved, and as you can see here, I go through this once. This was a very long conversation because my bot had some problems. Basically, it was not perfect. And I think that's important to point out as well is that these things are not going to be perfect from the get-go, especially if your software engineering experience is not the most comprehensive. And I had some experience with it. I studied it, but I wasn't like a professional or anything like that. So it basically, there were some things I just hadn't thought of, but that were pointed out to me by other by other Wikidata contributors, right? They were telling me, because at this point, right, if you have multiple matches, and I'll show you an example of an article with multiple matches that we found. We're going through these. I'll find these quickly. Here we go. I'll show you this one. So you see here, so these are left untouched because these are all matches. Ideally, right, we could potentially try to get rid of this one because these are the same author kind of here, and then these are two different authors actually, so you want to leave these alone, and these maybe because of the same one. You might want to deal with them eventually, but yeah, so originally right, just the first match, it added all the information to, and it just ignored these, but that is wrong because it might be, it's matching with Robbie Russell 2, but it's actually Robert B. Russell 3, which leads to problems in eventual sourcing and incorrect author citations, which are very dangerous and exactly what you want to avoid. So yeah, and I didn't realize how big of a problem that was until that was pointed out to me in my bot request, which is basically a formal process to get whatever tool you're making for Wikidata approved. And I talked with multiple contributors about those problems, what I was doing about those problems, and talking about the logic of my own bot. And that was eventually approved and it's running right now. It's set up on ToolForge, and right now I'm just getting the game to work as well. So yeah, that is how that works, and that is my Outreachy project. So I hope that taught you guys about what Outreachy is, as well as my own specific project. I have a bit of time before my session is up, so if anybody has any questions, I would be very happy to share. And thank you so much for having me. Yeah, of course. Feel free to turn on your microphone.
Hello?
Hello.
Yeah. So, yeah, the reason I'm interested in this project is because I was actually looking at Outreachy like recently as well, and I've been looking a lot at like the Cytoid refill, like the Zotero translation APIs that are used to import citations into Wikipedia articles. And yeah, so I actually just opened the files on Zotero translators that extract, because all they do, they're just like scraping tools that they just look at the website, and if there's no XML file to get the author data, then you just look at like a HTML element. And I was just looking at your bot. So do you read from like an XML file on the PubMed site, or?
So what you do is, and I'll go through PubMed specifically, is that all of these databases provide public APIs for accessing author information. So I'll just show you one, for instance, for PubMed. Yeah, so for instance, this is going to be an API call. Let's hope it loads. Yes, it does. And all it gives you is a file, or basically like just text.
And you just filter from the file.
Yeah, and you filter from that.
Okay.
Just because, going through XML files, it just kind of adds more mess, and you're not dealing with other parts of the article. By getting the citation, you're only dealing with the author information, which is what I was focused on. My co-intern kind of worked with kind of bigger API because they were adding articles, so they had to add things other than author information.
Yeah. Do you think this project, like, I don't know how the citations from Wikidata are used, but I think I read in a couple places like that there's like interest to make basically custom translators that extract citation information for use in Cytoid, because otherwise you have to put a translator through Zotero and they have to approve it. So it's like a bit. Do you think like it's possible that like the data from Wikidata for citations can be used as part of like a citing, like for the information that Cytoid gets?
Yeah, absolutely.
Buddy questioned it. Yeah.
Problem. I think really we're probably more familiar with Zytoid than I am, but like kind of the main thing that this thing is doing is the information that's being added here, and obviously I'm doing a bit of manual checking just to make sure my bot isn't going crazy. But as far as like
Yeah.
it might skip some things every once in a while, but all the author information that's being added is like basically guaranteed to be perfectly correct author information, which is links to direct citation that you can get. So you both have where you're getting that citation from, as well as a guarantee that the first name, last name, the way it's stated, and its position in the citation list are accurate. So yeah, without having to use a kind of custom citation on top of the Zotero file, you already have the authors and the positions in the citation and how that corresponds to a specific database. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for explaining. Yeah. That's all I had to ask. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. And as Mike pointed out, this kind of eventually leads to CiteQ, right, which using a Wikidata item gives you a final citation. And yeah. And this would basically provide kind of perfect name information. Yeah, so thank you so much for your questions. They're great ones. Does anyone have any other questions?
No problem.
Yeah, I'll leave that there for a second. I'll just talk a bit, and if anybody has any questions, feel free to interrupt me, just with the kind of 4 minutes we have left is I just would encourage, just because you mentioned looking at Outreachy and just anybody else's, I would really encourage applying, particularly if you're very keen and interested and kind of driven when it comes to software development. But I know, I mean, this kind of, I don't want this to sound like self-deprecating or anything, but I definitely lacked confidence and was a bit uncertain if I could ever get something like Outreachy or an internship in general. And I think Outreachy as an internship program, it's both quite self-driven, so you do need to be somebody who's quite willing to kind of put in the work and quite willing to kind of motivate yourself to get to specific areas, kind of find nitpicky problems, like I keep nitpicking, finding more things that might be added. Like I recently added the thing that identifies matches in strings and authors and gets rid of that automatically, as well as some other potential things. But it's also quite open and quite flexible and quite understanding. So if you're somebody who is very curious and very engaged and very interested in stuff like open source software, which I think is honestly probably the best kind of field with technology, right? It has the people that are the most passionate about what they're working at. It often is working on things that are not profit driven, and they often allow for people to be quite open and take people, to be real human beings and take them very seriously because of that. Yeah, so that's one thing I'd say is that I would really encourage applying for Outreachy. I think it's a great program, and I think it kind of talks about a lot of the good things that Castle offers and offer that. Yeah, and Mike is pointing out that as well, where the only reason the Wikimania Foundation hasn't offered more is because of lack of mentors. So if anybody here feels that they could mentor, that'd be great as well. The other thing I'd say, here it is, I wonder if I can find this. Yes, the other thing I'd say is if you're interested in looking at my co-interns bot request, here's the one that Zay made. And they were focused on directly adding articles. I can't speak too much about this because I'm the one making it, obviously. But this is focused on kind of using APIs from complexity to getting articles. Yeah, and I was more focused on existing articles. So if you're interested in that, that's there as well. And yeah, that's me. Basically, thank you so much for having me. I'll be here until 2 if anyone has any last minute questions. But thank you so much for having me. Really happy to do it.